We are Life Church Livonia.
And so some of you who are maybe a little hot or are guests are maybe hoping that it's not a super long sermon. It's not today. I kept it short because I love you. Okay? But we're still talking about important things. We're talking about God's word. We're talking about his calling to us and his invitation to us to be who God calls us to be. And we're right in the middle of this sermon series called My Big Fat Mouth. And so here's the beautiful thing about that. As I think about the ways that we as a congregation, as we as people can come alongside of these families, the ways that we can walk next to them and encourage them as they raise their children, one of the most important things we could do is that we could love them with our words, that we could be encouraging to them. Our words play a huge role in how we're able to do that. These parents, they need your encouragement. Did you know that parenting can be discouraging sometimes? Unbelievably discouraging. If you want to be humbled, if you want to be stripped down to the bare essence of you, have a child, adopt a child, foster a child, volunteer in kids ministry. It's good. It's holy. It's right. It's part of what God uses to transform us and change us. And in the midst of all of that, we need encouragement. Children, the children in our midst need you to use the words God has given you to encourage them as well, to lift them up, to speak hope and promise into them, to look at a child and say, I see something in you that is special. We need to use the mouth that God gave us to build up rather than to tear down, to invest in. But oftentimes if we're really honest about our mouths look more like the title of our sermon series, My Big Fat Mouth, than it does words of encouragement and hope and promise. And so that's why we've been talking about this. Week 1, we talked about complaining. And I know that for many of you, we talked in that whole week that you were very aware that you complained more than you thought you did. I know it's true for me. I know it's true for all of us. And my hope is that as we lean into this topic of what we do with our words, that it wouldn't just be a 1-week reprieve from complaining. So I want to remind you that complaining doesn't help. Complaining doesn't help. It actually redirects our heart away from God and towards our problems. Last week, Josh Merriweather came in and spoke to us about gossiping. Who was convicted last week about that? If you were not here, I urge you to go. No one raised their hand, by the way. I was the only one. Thanks for that, friends, leaving me all alone up here. So good. If you didn't have a chance to watch that message, I really encourage you to go online and watch it, lifechurchlivonia.org. But today we get to turn to another topic, the topic of criticizing. Criticism. And before we jump deeply in, I want to start with a story. Some of you may have heard me talk about this before. But the very first job that I ever had at a church on staff was in a church in Colorado. And a wonderful church, an amazing opportunity for me. I worked with student ministries there, and I started out as an intern and then filled in some other roles later. But one of the cool things about this church was that someone at some point in the life of the church, it probably came out of a sermon series, came up with the wonderful idea that we needed to encourage one another more. So they thought, what can we do as a church to empower, to enable people to be encouragers? And so they came up with this wonderful idea that in the back of the pews, because we had pews, they would put these little cards, and they called them encourage-ograms. Encourage-ograms. So the idea was that you could send like a handwritten note encouraging someone, and you could pull one out in the middle of the service, you could fill it out, you could hand it to someone you know in the lobby, or you could give it to a friend during the week, or you could put it in the offering plate when it came by if you wanted to specifically speak a word of encouragement over the staff of the church, over the pastors, or whatever it might be. And so this was the idea. That it would cause us to overflow with encouragement and to bind us together as a church. But I will tell you this, that the staff had a different phrase for the encourage-ograms. We called them discourage-ograms because people never used them to speak words of life into us. They would say awful things. People use the encourageograms or the discourageograms, as you want to call them, to criticize the way that we did church, to criticize the sermon, to criticize the worship song selection, to criticize the temperature in the room or the noise level from the soundboard. People use them to criticize things even as personal as your choice of clothing for that day when you stood on stage. Regularly, we had to come to a spot where when they would go through the offering plate and pull out the encourageograms, that there was someone screening them and throwing away certain notes that didn't belong there. Unbelievable. It was so bad that we actually, as staff, began to kind of campaign to get rid of the discourageograms. I think it came to a head when people started talking poorly about our choir director's wardrobe and commenting about whether or not her outfits made her look fat or thin. You would hope that in the church that this kind of thing would not be a problem. But the issue, friends, is that criticism is part of the reason why people don't want to come to church. It's part of the reason why people don't feel comfortable becoming, because they're afraid that if they come amongst us, that they will be the recipient of our holy criticism. It's not godly. It's not what we're called to do. It's not who we are called to be. And so we advocated that the encourageograms would go away, and when we moved into our new building, they did, at least for a season. And we encourage people to do something different, to speak words of life into people in other ways. And so I want to be really clear here as we jump into this topic of criticism, what we're not talking about. We're not talking about the kind of helpful feedback that you give people as you coach them, as you mentor them, as you train them. We all need that kind of constructive criticism to get better at what we're doing. To get better at a job, to get better at a role. These children that we dedicated today are going to need their parents to come alongside of them, constructively pointing out areas where they could do better or areas where they could grow. But the difference there is the goal. The difference is the goal. The kind of criticism that we are talking about today isn't constructive, it is destructive. The kind of criticism we're talking about today isn't constructive, it is destructive. Because its goal isn't to improve or perfect. The goal, its goal is to belittle, its goal is to nag, its goal is to demean, its goal is to force someone into a position where they act like we want them to act, talk like we want them to talk, think like we want them to think, live like we want them to live. It's an aggressive form of pushing and molding and sometimes attacking. It's a weaponized form of communication that is never helpful. And so if you're sitting here today and you are silently rejoicing that we picked this topic because Uncle Bob came to church today, stop it. Stop it. If you're sitting here today and hoping like, oh my goodness, I hope that my wife is paying attention, stop it. If you're sitting here and thinking, I hope my husband's paying attention, stop it. The name of this series isn't Their Big Mouth, it's My Big Fat Mouth. It's an opportunity for us to look at our own lives. And honestly, people, it's really easy to be hypercritical about other people. It's really easy to locate who they are. It's really easy to identify the critical people in our lives. But it's not always as easy to look in the mirror and see ourselves. It's not always as easy to look in the mirror and realize, wow, I'm actually the critic. It's really easy to feel justified in our criticism of other people because guess why? They actually deserve it, right? It's easy to feel justified because we look out and we're like, well, they actually deserve my criticism because they are wrong. They are living wrong. They're thinking wrong. They're acting wrong. They're doing everything wrong. And so we get critical about it. We're critical about how people dress, about what people post on social media. We're critical about how they drive. I need to confess for a moment, I am really critical of the way other people drive. I found myself doing that this week when someone didn't turn fast enough into a parking lot and they caused all the traffic to back up. I hate that. But I need to learn to keep my mouth shut about it. Is it really that big a deal, Brian, if the car in front of you took a little bit of extra time to turn into the parking lot? It's probably safer for them that way. No. Why am I so critical? Why do I feel the need to speak that out loud? It's because I feel justified in that moment. We're critical about the way other people raise their kids because we see them for a moment of weakness and the Target shopping line, and we judge them and we're critical of them, sometimes vocally, in a way that's not helpful. In a way that's not constructive, it's actually destructive. Critical people aren't shy about sharing their opinions of others, and sometimes it comes out as gossip, which Josh talked about last week. But have you ever been in a moment where someone is gossiping about another person, they're being critical away from that other person, and they're talking about them and what's wrong with their parenting, what's wrong with their driving, what's wrong with their life, what's wrong with their financial habits, and someone calls them out on it, and they say, hey, you shouldn't really gossip about that person. And what do they say? Well, I'd say it to their face if they were standing here. And then they do. These are critical people. And God calls us to not be one of those individuals. So important. It's so important that we understand that this type of talk will never produce any healthy relational fruit in your life. It will not bring about the change you want to see. And honestly, what it will end up doing is destroying your relationships. And Scripture is really clear about this. Galatians chapter 5, starting in verse 14. Verse 14 is something you're really familiar with. Even if you don't go to church, you've probably heard parts of this. It's because it says this: for the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. We've heard this, right? We know that this is supposed to be the hallmark of the Christian faith, of what it looks like to be a Christ follower. That everything we do and everything we are hinges upon this one thing, that we are to love your neighbor as yourself, that we love Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. It hinges upon love. But we often, when we read Galatians chapter 5, we stop there. And we don't read the very next verse, which says this: if you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. Listen to it again. If you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. Now, the author of Galatians wasn't only talking about criticizing, but criticizing is certainly a part of the way that we bite and devour each other. Here's my question for you. What if your mouth, what if your critical words were actually destroying intimacy in your marriage? What if that was the wedge being driven into the intimacy of your marriage? What if your critical words or your critical spirit was wrecking the self-confidence of your children? So many people in this room have told me their story about the way that people in their life growing up, maybe it was a dad or a mom or an aunt or an uncle or a coach, spoke critical words over them, and they believed those critical words, and it ruined their self-confidence. What if it was your words that was doing that to children? What if your critical words were the cause of distance between you and your friends? What if your critical words were damaging your ability to share your faith with people? You've invited people to church before, but they always say no because they look at you and they think, why would I want to go to church with a person that's that critical? What if this was true? Would you change? Would you change the way that you talk? Because friends, your mouth plays a vital role in the health of your relationships. Your mouth plays a vital role in the health of your relationships, and it matters to God. Because what we don't want to be is a people that bite and devour each other and end up destroying each other. Because when the people from the outside look in at the church and they see that, they don't want to be a part of it. When people from the church go out into the world and we do this, people don't want a part of it. We are the bearers, the trustees of the greatest hope, the greatest love, the greatest amazing story that has ever been told. And sometimes our ability to tell that story is hindered by our very words, our critical natures, our critical spirits, our critical words. So what if we decided, as a little microcosm of the greater church around the world, that we were going to use our words to build up rather than to tear down? Listen to Proverbs 12, verse 18. The words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. Sometimes our criticism isn't even intentional, it's just reckless. It's a moment of unfiltered communication. I'm a verbal processor. Any verbal processors in the room? Come on, I know I'm not the only one. I love that I'm a verbal processor. It's part of who I am. It's part of what enables me to come up here and do what I do. It's part of what helps me be creative and to solve problems. But I have, especially in my past, when I was younger, and even when I am tired or when I'm emotional, I'm sometimes reckless with my words. I'm verbally processing, but in the midst of my verbally processing, I become reckless, and those words pierce like swords. But what I long to have happen with my mouth and with your mouths and all of us is that our tongues instead would bring healing. They would move away from reckless speech and move into intentional speech. It would move away from words that harm. We'd slide into a space where our words bring healing. One reckless word of criticism can crush a dream. It can destroy someone's self-confidence. One reckless word can end a relationship, but the opposite is also true. One word can change someone's life for the good. One word can unknowingly set someone on a new and beautiful trajectory. One word over Benjamin or Lucy or Leah or Annika can help guide them into a space of hope and trust and love. Can guide them into a career in nursing or in teaching or whatever it might be that God calls them to do, or into engineering or whatever it might be, or into a place of ministry. One word over someone might lead them into a space where they end up around the world spreading the good news of Jesus in some other country. One word has the power to change someone's life. And sometimes you don't even know that you've done it. Let's go back to the encourage-o-gram story again. So part of my resistance to the negative movement of these cards was that I used them for what they were supposed to be used for. And because I was living in Colorado, I was far from all of my family. I didn't really have anyone to sit with at church other than the students I ministered with. So we would all sit together. And what I started doing is I would use the encourage-o-grams to write notes to the students that were sitting next to me. And I probably did it in such a way that it wasn't always very mature. I probably interrupted the sermon a few times, and I'm passing notes down the aisle. I was that guy. I'm sorry, Pastor Wes Swanson, for what I did, okay? But it was good because, listen, we also did events at students' houses. And they would invite us over, they would invite us in, and sometimes when I arrived at the house a little bit early for the event, they would say, hey, you want a tour of the house? You want to see around? I would say, sure, I would love to. And so on one occasion, I went over to the student's house for this event that we were going to have. I think we were just going to have a bunch of students over for a barbecue and play games. And they said, hey, you want to see the house? And I said, sure. And we walked down, and we're going through their house, and when I came into this individual's bedroom with them to kind of see where they stayed, I noticed a bulletin board on the wall. It was filled with all sorts of things that were incredibly special to her. There were pictures of her family on special occasions. There were a couple of medals that had been won in sporting events. There was a certificate of commendation for something that had happened at school. All these important things. And right in the middle was an encourage-o-gram that I had written to her on a whim in the middle of someone's sermon, and it was kind of goofy. It said, you make my heart leap for joy, which was true. This person brought joy to me, and so I just said, you make my heart leap with joy, and I passed it down the aisle, and it made it onto the bulletin board of fame. This isn't about me. I didn't even know I'd done it. I wasn't even aware of the impact that it would have. And I asked her, I said, oh my goodness, how did my encourageogram end up on your board? And she said, because it mattered to me. It mattered to me. And it encouraged me in a time when I needed encouragement. Friends, our words not only have the power to tear down, they have the power to build up. When we go back to Proverbs again, the words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. I can't claim to have been wise then. I probably wasn't. I was in my 20s and had no idea what I was doing. But that moment, God used my faithfulness to encourage someone who desperately needed it and to bring healing in a space that needed to be healed. Criticism can tear someone down, but encouragement always builds people up. Which type of person do you want to be? Do you want to be a fault finder? We all know people like this. Maybe it's you. Someone who can see the fault in every person around them. They don't chew properly. They're not quiet enough. They talk too loud. They don't walk right. They don't drive right. Their breathing can be annoying to you. And you can see the fault in every single thing that the people around you do. You can see the fault, what's wrong with our government. You can see what's wrong with the schools. You can see what's wrong with the roads. You can see what's wrong with everything. And inadvertently, you become a fault finder. You can go to work and you can say, I can see exactly what's wrong with the meeting and the way that you ran that meeting, boss. I can look at the shows you're watching. I can find fault in what you're watching. I can see what you eat. I can see where you go on vacation. And we become fault finders and we become critical spirits. Do we want to be that kind of person? Have you ever looked out at all of your friends and acquaintances and looked at the fault finder that you know, because we all know them, and thought to yourself, man, I really want to be like them when I grow up? No. The children that we dedicated today, they're watching you. They're watching me. They're watching us. Do we want to model for them what it looks like to be a fault finder, or do we want to model for them what it looks like to be a hope dealer? Not a dope dealer, okay? Don't go home and say the pastor said we should all become dope dealers. Hope, enunciation is important. Do you want to be a fault finder or a hope dealer? What if instead of looking for things that are wrong, we were constantly looking for ways to build up? What if instead of looking for things that are wrong, we were looking for things that were really good and beautiful and hope-filled about that person? This is the kind of person that steps into a messy situation and brings love and grace and truth and beauty and opportunity and hope. Even when people, these kind of people know that criticism is warranted, they will hold back. And bring it at a time when it can be constructive. Bring it at a time when it can bring change. Bring it at a time when it can bring restoration. But they know when to speak a word of encouragement, and they know when the opportunity has come to speak a word of correction. When we become hope dealers instead of fault finders, we model ourselves after God. Listen to Romans 15:13. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. This is who our God is. This is who Jesus was. This is who he calls us to be. To speak words of life and grace and peace and hope over people. Jesus did this all the time. I could go through his life and read story after story after story where he could have been a fault finder. That was one of his main gripes about the Pharisees, who were teachers of the law at the time. One of his main gripes was that they were fault finders, and he said, I'm not going to be like that. I'm going to be a hope dealer. Think about this time when the Pharisees, they dragged a woman before Jesus, and they had found fault in her because she had committed adultery, and they dragged her before Jesus, and they threw her at his feet, and they said, what are you going to do about this? They wanted him to step into the place of condemnation where he condemned her, where he criticized her, where he lived fully into the punishment that she deserved. But instead of becoming a fault finder that moment, Jesus became a hope dealer. Instead of condemning her and criticizing her, he actually transformed her with his words and brought life and encouragement and transformation. And I really believe change. Change. And as he ministered to this woman, broken, hurting, embarrassed, scared, he transformed that situation with a few words. And he turned to the Pharisees around him and he said, "What about you? What about you? Anyone here that is without sin, without fault? Go ahead, I invite you, condemn her." He said to them, those of you who are without sin should go ahead and pick up a stone and throw it at her. And they all trickled away, starting first with the oldest ones who were wise. This is what our Jesus does for all of us. He sees us where we're at. He meets us where we're at. He speaks words of hope and encouragement and love to us where we're at. And he lifts us up out of our messy, broken lives. And he forgives us even for the way that we have been critical. And he reminds us, I gave you that mouth. I shaped that tongue inside of you. And I ask you that you would use it to be a healing balm to the people around you so that we could model for the next generation what it looks like to be a hope dealer. What about you? What about us? Who will we be? What will we do? How will we respond? Will we be marked by criticism, or will we be marked by encouragement? That's what I long to see happen today. Would you pray with me? Jesus, I know that there are people here in our midst that need a word of encouragement today. So Lord, I pray that you would give us each an opportunity to do so. Maybe it's just a gentle word. Maybe it's a smile. Maybe it's a hug, God. But there are people here today that need an encouragement, God. And I pray that you would give us opportunities to do that today. I pray that you would give us eyes to see those people. You would give us eyes to see the ones in the checkout line that are struggling with their children. And instead of giving a critical glance or a glare, instead of speaking a word of condemnation over them because they just bought their child who was throwing a temper tantrum, a piece of candy, that we would instead be a person that brings hope. We would instead be a person that brings encouragement. So God, I pray that you would help us to be that. We confess, God, that we are not always that way. We confess that we are too often fast to be critical and slow to be encouraging. God, forgive us for that. And Jesus, I know that there are people here in our midst today who have never experienced what it's like to be in a relationship with you. If they've never had an opportunity to have a relationship with God, that all they have is an idea in their head about this critical, mean-spirited God, but you are not that God. So today, God, I pray that they would have an experience with you as we worship, as we pray, as we learn to trust you, as we learn to understand who you are, that they would experience you and be transformed by it. And if you are that person sitting here thinking to yourself, I had no idea that our God was a hope bringer, I invite you to simply and quietly in your heart say, God, I want that. I want to be that person that gets lifted up, raised up, transformed and healed, forgiven and set free. I want to be that person so that I might bring your hope to the world. I choose you, God. I commit myself to that way. And I pray these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.